and welcome everybody. Dakota Shane here with another edition of Good Writing. And today we're going to be talking about a short story by George Saunders that I haven't reread that much over the years. I feel like I've reread it 2, maybe 3 times before deciding to film this video. But it's one I've thought about countless times, which really goes to show how much resonance, how much impact it's had when we return to pieces of writing that frequently, whether it's just thinking about the piece, telling other people about the piece, or going and actually rereading this. So without further ado, well, I guess you know the story by the title of this video, but this is the 400-pound CEO, which is a part of his collection, Civilwarland, in Bad Decline. And a little bit about George Saunders. So Saunders, for those who don't know, is the author of a dozen books, including Lincoln and the Bardo, which went on to win the Booker Prize in 2017 as the best work of fiction in English. He's a lauded, very well-respected contributor for The New Yorker and considered by many to be the GOAT of short fiction, at least living right now. The Wall Street Journal actually went as far to say that his writing has changed the trajectory of American fiction. So there you go. He's great. If you haven't read anything by him, I highly encourage it. We'll be covering him a lot on this channel, as you probably already know, because 2 episodes in and 2 works by George Saunders. So that tells you what you need to know. So anyway, 400-pound CEO. This is from, again, the first and now iconic collection, Civilwarland in Bad Decline, which was originally published all the way back in 1996, but has really since just continued to gain momentum, respect in the space, and almost have a cult-like following, as Saunders does across the board. But this collection is, at least the people I talk to, a lot of their favorites. I know personally I would put 10th of December and Civilwarland in Bad Decline as a tie for me with Saunders personally, but I think you could make the case for either. Anyway, I'm going to start with the summary of this short story. So feel free, if I will say there'll be spoilers here, so feel free to skip ahead. I have the chapters and the timestamps down below, so feel free if you don't want to spoil anything, you can skip ahead. But 400-pound CEO is told from the perspective of a man who really struggles with his weight, named Jeffrey. And Jeffrey works at a company called the Humane Raccoon Resources, the HRR, which quite literally gets rid of raccoons by killing them, but tells their clients that they're doing so in a very humane way. So from the beginning, you kind of are thrown into this outrageous sort of what's real, what isn't type of fabricated universe. And the boss who founded HRR, he's an angry and just pretty damn despicable human being named Tim. He actually was released from jail for manslaughter before founding the HRR, so that tells you a little bit more about him. But this story, it's again told from, it's a first-person narration from Jeffrey's standpoint, and Jeffrey's coworkers are just so horrible and mean to Jeffrey. Some of it is honestly kind of hard to read, just like always making jokes about his weight, comparing him to an elephant, buying him hippo magnets, just like really, really brutal stuff on a daily basis that Jeffrey has to suffer through. Just full transparency there if that's something that you feel might be a bit hard to read like I do. And to give an example of this, Jeffrey ends up finding himself in love with one of his coworkers, Frida, and he actually ends up later in the story getting her to say yes to a dinner with him, only to find out later that Tim, the boss, made a bet with her that she wouldn't be seen in public with Jeffrey. And that illustrates and encapsulates a lot of the abuse that Jeffrey has to go through during this story. And of course that leads to a downward spiral of sorts emotionally for a couple weeks for Jeffrey. But anyway, fast forward. So it turns out Frida and Tim, the boss, are actually romantically involved. And Jeffrey sees that Tim had hit Frida. She's badly bruised one day. So he plans on telling Tim off and everything. So he's staying behind work. And one night, not the same night, Jeffrey later on in the day spots Tim following an animal rights activist who has a camcorder, and the animal rights activist is recording to expose the lies that HRR is telling. And Jeffrey, by just seeing Tim, he knows that Tim is gonna mean this woman harm. So one thing leads to another. Jeffrey comes up and he ends up killing Tim by accident. So, and I won't spoil it totally, but this is what happens. And he thinks quick. He ends up burying Tim, and he forges a letter from Tim saying that he went to Mexico and that he appoints Jeffrey as the interim CEO while he's away. So Jeffrey, for a day, is the CEO, which is where the title comes from, with 400-pound CEO. But his tenure is short-lived. The police, unsurprisingly, find out what he did, and they arrest him, and he's sent to jail, and that's how the story ends. So shifting away from summary, we'll talk a bit about a couple takeaways I had, and then shift focus into principles that we all can apply to our own writing to improve it, and not just writing, but artists and craft in general. One thing that stood out to me as I reread this was how often we remember how writing makes us feel and not necessarily the plot. I'll be honest, it's kind of embarrassing, but I didn't even remember until like a couple pages before that Jeffrey killed Tim. I totally forgot that was that huge detail in the story. But the last passage, which I'll be reading later on in this video, is really what sticks with me with this story. I remember how this story made me feel, and I remember the principles that and the core values and the themes and everything that Saunders was exploring in this piece more than I did the plot. So I thought that was just interesting, something to keep in mind, and just a piece that I think is important to remember as we're writing, because it's something that can only happen, I feel like, this is my opinion, when we're being our true 100% authentic selves and writing how we want to write. I feel like that shows, and that helps your readers feel that emotion behind your writing. Second here is Jeffrey's level of self-awareness as a character study. So what makes this story so powerful, I feel like, is, one of the many things, but it's Jeffrey is so self-aware of who he is, what he believes he can bring to the world, his shortcomings, what he is, and it makes it so much harder to stomach some of the atrocities that he has to face, because he's aware that he's self-aware. So a few quotes here that I think bring this to light is Jeffrey says, 30 more years of this and I'm out of it without hurting anybody or embarrassing myself. And another, I feel life should offer more than this. So Jeffrey, he's past the point of wanting that basic happiness, that purpose and sense of life and lightness. He just wants to get through this life without hurting anybody and without embarrassing himself. And I think the fact that he's reached that point, it really expresses and gives you insight into where Jeffrey is in a very tangible and tactile and visceral way. That's the word I was looking for. And just not embarrassing myself. I think that is something that sticks with you and resonates throughout. He also goes on to say, another quote is, I'm huge and terrified of becoming bitter. And this is a theme, a thought, an idea that I think about quite a bit, of how much of life And it wasn't just this story where I've thought about this, it's been recurring, but it also, I feel like, puts it in such a way that I probably couldn't. But just going off of how much of life is battling bitterness. I feel like bitterness, there's anger, I feel like anger is explored a lot in literature and movies and the public sphere and arts, whereas in hatred and grief and just downcast, downtrodden, I don't feel like bitterness is explored as widely. And it really makes me think of parallels to, we'll say, relationships. So Esther Perel, Dr. Esther Perel, she's a relationship expert. She talks a lot about this. And she actually says the one thing that relationships cannot come back from, like it's the kiss of death, is resentment. Infidelity, she's seen people come back from. Any sorts of other ups and downs, she's seen people come back from. What she hasn't, or she sees very little of, is resentment from one partner to another. I feel the same about bitterness. I feel that, and we've all met people who have reached that point in life where if you're bitter, that poison just, it poisons the whole well, it poisons the whole pond. And I think that Jeffrey, knowing that he can't, no matter what he does, he can't be bitter. Like that is, I'm terrified of becoming bitter. And it gives you that sense that he's fighting for something. He might not be fighting. He's past the point of fighting for happiness. He's past the point of fighting for just the bareness, the bare basics. He just can't be bitter. That's something that really that I took away from this piece a lot. And he also says, after he kills Tim, when push comes to shove, it's me I want to protect. So there's a level, again, of self-awareness that in that moment he realized that maybe this is just all for me. And who can blame him? We're all selfish creatures. He's been treated like dirt by everybody. He actually is much, I don't know about you, but if you read this and you put yourself in his shoes, I think he's handling it so much better than 99.9% of us would. So now on to principles. So we're going to talk about a few takeaways that I think this short story illustrates when it comes to writing that we can all apply into our own work, into our own art, into our own stories, fiction, narrative, nonfiction, you name it. So one thing that really comes to mind for this that I think Saunders does such a brilliant job of is the principle of, as a writer, don't shy away from tilled soil. And what I mean by that is a lot of times I feel like, at least me and my writer friends, my artist friends, we really shy away from what we consider the cliche or what's been covered a lot. Like we are scared to approach those subjects, that tilled soil that's been covered by artists that frankly we probably feel like are better than us or have more experience than us or have more accolades and everything. So we tend to shy away from tilled soil. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read the last few passages of this short story to you, and we'll talk about why I think this is important. I'm going to try and get through this without getting too emotional. This always hits me like a freight train, so fair warning. So these are the last couple passages right after Jeffrey gets captured by the police. I have a wild desire to smell the ocean. I have a sense that God is unfair and preferentially punishes his weak, his dumb, his fat, his lazy. I believe he takes more pleasure in his perfect creatures and cheers them on like a brainless dad as they run roughshod over the rest of us. He gives us a need for love and no way to get any. He gives us a desire to be liked and personal attributes that make us utterly unlikable. Having placed his flawed and needy children in a world of exacting specifications, he deducts the difference between what we have and what we need from our hearts and our self-esteem and our mental health. Maybe the God we see, the God who calls the daily shots, is merely a sub-God. Maybe there's a God above this sub-God who's busy for a few God minutes with something else and will be right back. And when he gets back, we'll take the sub-God by the ear and say, We'll take the sub-God by the ear and say, now look at that fat man. What did he ever do to you? Wasn't he humble enough? Didn't he endure enough abuse for 1,000 men? Weren't the simplest tasks hard? Didn't you sense him craving affection? Were you unaware that his days unraveled as one long bad dream? And maybe as the sub-God slinks away, the true God... And maybe as the sub-God slinks away, the true God will sweep me up in his arms, saying, my sincerest apologies, a mistake has been made. Accept a new birth as token of my esteem. And I will emerge again from between the legs of my mother, a slighter and more beautiful baby, destined for a different life, in which I am masterful, sleek as a deer, a winner. Oh, sorry, that always hits me. Just just knowing that there are people, and we all go through stuff like that too, right? But there are just some people that live life in that way. It just is a lot. Anyway, so now that I'm a blubbering mess, but I feel like something that really resonates with me there is how much of, so we've heard, if Saunders went with this theme, this idea of like shying away from tilled soil, he might have not had that thought. That the thought that he has is something that's been said time and time and time again in so many different iterations and so many different religions and so many different works of art of why does God let these things happen? Why does God let these atrocities happen? Doesn't he have compassion enough to remember me? It's something that we've all, heard a million times, but the way that he said it right there in those last passages are just new. They're novel, they're brand new. And it's something that really stuck out to me of if he would have let the idea of letting cliche ideas fall by the wayside because I have nothing more to add, he wouldn't have written that gorgeous last passage for us to all really think about and dissect a little bit. So principle number 1, don't shy away from tilled soil if you're a writer. And second principle here, one that I think ties into this passage as well, is the importance of jotting down your ideas and journaling. Like, if you would have just heard that last passage, let me know if you feel different. I'm happy to discuss, but I feel like that passage alone could have been a journal entry. I feel like that passage could have been Saunders walking one day and seeing someone who's less fortunate or seeing something, anything, something happening with animals and birds, and that sprang a thought in his head. And I think as writers, E.B. White has this beautiful analogy with writing where he, which whether you agree or not with hunting, it's just, I think you'll appreciate it either way, but he likens ideas in writing to hunting birds, that it crosses your mind and you have to get it. You have to capture it or it's gone forever. And I feel like that this short story really illustrates the importance of that, because you might have an idea that whizzes by like a bird and not have anywhere to put it yet. It might be 5, 6, 7, 10 years until you're writing another piece of fiction, and then you're like, wow, that thought actually would fit perfect as this last passage, or fit perfect as this piece of dialogue or monologue for this character. So I think it's just so important to keep that in mind as a writer, and that last passage is evidence of this, in my opinion. All right, next is the power of details in description. So this is something that I think Saunders just does such a great job with across the board. But I want to read a passage from you, or for you. So this is Frida. This is right before Jeffrey and Frida are going out on a date, or what he thinks is a date, as we've already mentioned. And he goes in and he sees Frida. He meets Frida's son, who's a toddler. He comes out, one tiny eyebrow, and this is Jeffrey talking about Len, who's the child. He comes out, one tiny eyebrow cocks up at my physical appearance. Then he crawls into my lap, holding his mega death dealer by the cowl. What a sweet boy. The dealer's got a severed human head in its hands. When you pull a string, the dealer cries, "You're dead, and I've killed you, Prince of Slime," and sticks his day-glow tongue out. I give Len my anti-violence spiel. I tell him only love can dispel hate. I tell him we were meant to live in harmony and give one another emotional support. He looks at me blankly, then flings his death dealer at the cat. So this may seem like just another work of, prose or description, but something that I think we can all take away, and I think Saunders does a great job throughout if you read his other works too, is how powerful details are when it comes to description. He could have wrote that the child has a toy, and the toy is a cowboy, and this and that. But no, he went a step further, 2 steps further, and actually gave it a name, Mega Death Dealer. And he talks about how he pulled the string and it said Prince, like something something Prince of Slime. And those little details, while they might seem tedious, add such a realism and realistic layer to your writing. It puts you right in it. It really makes you feel like the characters are real, and it makes them pop off the page even more. So I thought that is something we can all take into our own writing, because I really do feel like 99 out of 100 writers would have written that interaction differently. I feel like they would have stuck by it, or kind of maybe even not even had the son in the story in general, or just kind of brush by it in a lackadaisical way. Whereas Saunders went 2 steps further, 1 step further, 3 steps further, by really thinking about details that can make this character come to life, even if he's there just for a page or 2. The fourth and final principle here that I want to cover is the poignancy of brevity. And I'm going to read you another passage here. And I feel like by nature, short fiction is brief, So you could say that any amazing short story embodies this, but I feel like this interaction really embodies this principle even more. So this is when Frida and Jeffrey, this is after Jeffrey returns back to work after he was heartbroken by how he found out Frida had taken a bet for $50 to take him on a date. So he's back, and this is his first interaction with Frida after that. "Do you hate me?" Frida asks. "No," I say. "I truly enjoyed our evening together." "God, I didn't," she says. "Everyone kept staring at us. It made me feel bad about myself that they thought I was actually with you. Do you know what I mean?" I can't think of anything to say, so I nod. Then I retreat moist-eyed to my cubicle for some invoicing fun. I'm not a bad guy. If only I could stop hoping. If only I could say to my heart, "Give up. Be alone forever." There's always opera. There's angel food, cake, and neighborhood children caroling, and the look of autumn leaves on a wet roof. But no, my heart's some kind of idiotic fishing bobber. My invoices go well. The sun sinks, the moon rises, round and pale as my stupid face. it's another instance of Saunders could, and I feel like so many other writers would have really leaned into that more and written just passages and passages and monologues and all of this on that principle. But he instead just is brief with it. And what that does is the brevity of that, instead of going full on into these more monologues and self-loathing and everything, it just, how quickly it turns and shifts, make you feel even more bad for Jeffrey, because it's almost like this just is another day. This just happens. This is how it usually is. So he kind of whizzes by it in his description of it. So that really is something I think we can take into our own writing. I think that knowing when to dive deeply into an idea and knowing when to let the audience dive deep themselves into an idea is something that is such a powerful tool in a writer's tool belt. Knowing how to dance, knowing when to lean more one way or another, knowing the rhythm, saying it out loud as after you wrote it to really get that sing-songy element to it is something that I think this work just does such a great job of time and time again. And Saunders, frankly, does an amazing job of in all of his work, really, that at least I've come across. Great. So those are the 4 principles. I want to end with an exercise that I think for those who want extra credit or whatever you want to call it. I love this exercise, and it actually started with Saunders. So I hope that you find value in this if you're curious, if you've liked what you've heard so far in this episode. And if anything, it'll just continue to stretch your muscle as a writer. So I call it the opening line exercise. So I personally, as a writer, before Saunders and before I got more into shorter fiction and flash fiction and short stories and novellas, I was such a plotter. I was such a architect. I had to outline everything. I had to outline my outlines. I had to outline my outlines of outlines. I had to outline my character arcs before I even knew the character. And, you know, there are certain genres I feel like that really plays well into things. But there is something about, Stephen King talks about this too, how letting your characters speak to you and kind of tell you what to do. There's something powerful about that, whether you're an architect or a gardener, to use that metaphor of someone who more so lets the story lead them than them lead the story. And so what I did was I would start a story or just a thought with one of the most outlandish things I can possibly think of, and then let the story go from there. Let your imagination take over. Let your characters speak to you in that way. And I think the 400-pound CEO does a good job of that, just with its opening line. So I'll read it. At noon, another load of raccoons comes in, and Claude takes them out back of the office and executes them with a tire iron. That's crazy. Like, if you would have heard that, you would have been like, what the hell is going on in this story? And then it just writes itself. One, your readers are hooked, but this is more so for writing. So take just an outlandish opening line, an outlandish premise, an outlandish idea, and write a short story from it. So say something like that and then go from there. Don't plan anything, just plot it. It could be a 1-page story. It could be a 10-page story. It could end up being a novel. Who knows? But I think the opening line exercise is something that really can help stretch your ideas. And if you're ever just in a writer, like experiencing writer's block or anything, this is also a great exercise that I like to do, is just starting with a really outlandish sentence and then letting the story take you where it does. All right, well, that was the 400-pound CEO and another edition of Good Writing with me, Dakota Shane. Thanks so much for watching and making me a part of your day. Wherever you are, whoever you are, I hope your plate is full. I hope your heart is light. And I hope that before we speak again, that you get lost in some good writing. I'll see you next time.